Okay, hi everyone. This is the second iteration of the week one lecture. The first one that I did um, was just an audio recording due to technical difficulties. We've got those sorted out now, so it's taken me a while to get back to coming back to redo this first one. Hopefully, you've sort of gotten enough information by now, anyway. But here it is again, just for one or two people in particular who came into the unit after the first week. So, welcome to the unit. If this is the first time that you looked at this is intercultural competence and communication. This is the introductory lecture for week one. I'm going to look at some broad themes, key concepts relating to the main question: what is cultural competence and why study it? So, what is cultural competence? What are we doing here? Cultural competence is the ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures. Uh, Cultural competence is also a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals and enable them to work effectively in cross-cultural settings. So I think that's implied by the idea of cultural competence. We're finding ways and means of better connecting with people from different backgrounds and learning to be more adept at communicating with those from different backgrounds, those with whom we are generally unfamiliar. Cultural competence encompasses then being aware of one's own worldview as a subjectivity, as opposed to normality. This means basic. What's a subjectivity? A subjectivity is our um, particular view of the world. I mean, I think sometimes we like to, like to imagine that our view of the world is the only way, the best way to look at the world. But the fact is that there are what 6 billion of us, and which means that there are 6 billion different perspectives on the world, on the state of the human condition and the meaning of our presence here and how to create meaning in life. So, we counterpose subjectivity to the idea of normality, because the idea of normality suggests that there's a fixed, immutable way of understanding reality, and we kind of tend to assume, along with that anything that falls outside of what's considered normal is well, I mean, what's the opposite of normal? The opposite of normal is deviant, um, and is does which I mean, this begs the question: does something that falls outside of the known necessarily make it bad? And I think the sensible answer to that one is no. And this is kind of a key point in beginning to understand understand and appreciate the meaning and value of cultural competence, to know that the point of view that we enter the world with and that conditions us as we grow up is one of innumerable, and not to assume that just because the one that we have and know is the only one we know, it's universal, because it's very certainly not. And I mean, if everyone on the planet who grows up and is conditioned by a particular set of cultural values assumes that there's universal, then then you've got immediate grounds, conditions for conflict, because people are not going to be able to deal with perspectives other than their own, and it's just not a sustainable way of operating. And you could argue that a lot of the conflict and tension that we see in the world today is the result of this tendency to assume that our subjective worldview is normal and universal, and trying to impose it on others, and then provoking the inevitable reaction. So, the first thing that we're going to look at here in beginning to think about cultural competence is understanding that the subjective basis of our own worldview, and the completely subjective nature of ideas of normality. So, in coming to terms with that, we need to start thinking about developing positive attitudes towards cultural differences. Okay, well, we have a subjective view on the world. It's one point of view. Maybe good, maybe bad. Maybe somewhere in between. It's one of many, and when it comes down to individuals, it's one of 6 billion or so. So, maybe the other perspectives have something to offer us. Maybe we can broaden our own perspective by taking in experiences, knowledge, insight from other perspectives. So to that end, there's no shortage of reasons to develop positive attitudes towards cultural differences. And at the same time, with a view to gaining knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews, because there's just so many out there, and so much to offer. How do we conceive of cultural competence? In a word, is it not comprehension? It's not the capacity to listen and pay attention to what someone else is saying. When they're saying something you don't understand, to find figure out what they're talking about, and equate yourself with unfamiliar perspectives. Our intrepid tutor from Horsham, Amelia Crafter, came up with a great couple of examples of miscomprehension. Amelia mentioned a story about going to visit a friend in Queensland who was preparing to travel overseas, and the friend was saying was talking about needing to get a port, and Amelia said to me, she was saying to her friend, "What do you need to take fortified wine for you with you overseas for? You can buy it duty free, cheaper. You crazy?" And the friend's carrying on about a port, and after some minutes, the friend stopped and said, "Well, I need something to carry my clothes in." And this is Amelia was saying, she kind of had a moment of confusion and then clarity. Oh, you mean your suitcase? I've never heard anyone in my life refer to a suitcase as a port, but this was, apparently this is a Queensland thing. I've never even heard Queenslanders refer to it before. Maybe she was a Kiwi or something, and it was even far more removed. But this is a minor example between A, people who speak the same language, B, people who live in the same country, C, people who know each other, friends, but because they lacked shared understanding of the meaning of the word port. Well, you port stuff around in a suitcase. I don't know. It's a suitcase to me, but because there was the lack of shared understanding, there's basic miscomprehension, and therefore, cultural miscommunication. And it's a cultural thing, the names we have for things. So that's a minor, a small kind of example of much larger processes that we'll look at throughout the semester, and we have been looking at. Another comparable example that Amelia mentioned, I think we can safely call this Amelia's rule by now. Just consider the results you'll get if you invite Australians to dinner and suggest that they wear their thongs, and then go and do the same with people from the US. I think you might you know, they might say, "You sure about wearing thongs to dinner? Isn't it a bit informal?" You go, "Oh, that's okay. We're pretty casual here. We like you to feel comfortable. So you might get slightly different results if you invite someone from the US to dinner and say, it's okay if they want to wear their thongs. No, it's all right. Just it's easy to slip on. It's it's don't no no don't go to any great effort. Are you sure? That's my really bad American accent. Well, okay. You said wear my thong, so comprehension and shared understandings, and you can get them even between people who share the language. Motivating factors. I mean, why are we here? Why are we studying intercultural competence? Well, some motivating factors for looking at this area. Increased ease of international travel. I mean, people are just moving around. We were talking in the lecture the other day about the amount of people who are in the air at any one time, and students had their computers, so they looked it up. Apparently, there are 6,000 aircraft in the air at any one time, and each one of those has 250 people. So what's 6 times 250? 6,000 times 250, quite a lot. So a lot of people in the air, like a million people. So there's I mean, these are people just moving around within any given day. So we're moving around a lot. We've got people moving from country to country to settle, people moving to travel. We're connected globally via the internet. We don't even have to leave our living rooms to talk to people from the other side of the planet, and potentially to talk to people from other cultures. It's more and more easy every day. And the myriad of platforms for social media as well, all the more so. Again, the increased movement across national borders by migrants and refugees. We were talking at one stage about the hysteria that we get in this country every decade or so, when the sort of dominant culture is disturbed by the appearance of a new immigrant group. I mean, in the 50s it was the Greeks and Italians, and 70s it was Vietnamese, in the 80s there was Lebanese, 90s Asians, the noughties, Arabs with the war on terror and stuff like that, and these days it's Sudanese because of the war that's going on there. I mean, it's funny to see Pauline Hanson and One Nation up in arms in the 90s about the Asians and all this kind of carry on, and now apparently Asians are great. They love Asians. I'm very happy with Asians, but now it's Muslims who are the issue. Nothing like consistency, but this is this arguably kind of this this idea of universalism and normality. They're disrupting a way of life, and they just sort of don't want to. I like to keep things normal. They don't like change. I think it's a truism that change is the greatest constant in the universe. If you make an enemy of change by embracing this idea of normality, you're making a true enemy of yourself. And this would appear to be why we get these crazy reactions every time there's some kind of social upheaval or something like that, and you get an influx of refugees. It's it's happened so many times now. It's impossible to miss. Increased global demand for ESL training in the international lingua franca. If you look at the readings for the first week, there's maybe 1 billion people, not even, who are native English speakers, but we also happen to be in the the sort of richest countries in the world, the ones who benefited the most from 500 years of colonialism. So we can take it for granted that we can go anywhere in the world and speak English and be understood, or be have people try to understand us because they need to know English. But if you speak Swahili or Vietnamese or Dutch, just trying to think of kind of suitably random languages. You're in trouble. Like if you speak I don't know, Pushtun or something like that. You go to Thailand, and try to be understood. You're gonna struggle. You have to use hand gestures and stuff like that. So English is the lingua franca, and as we'll see, there are a myriad of cultural. There's a lot of cultural. I mean, how is culture communicated? Culture is communicated through language. So there's a lot of cultural baggage associated with ESL training. So even wanting to teach English to non-native English speakers requires some sense of intercultural competence to be able to speak to teach people in the terms they understand, and sort of understand their learning styles, the way they carry themselves, and to anticipate that people will learn differently. Increased understanding of the cultural diversity. I mean, just even to be effective citizens, members of society, to be able to anticipate changes to social composition and to be able to act within them. And outstanding social justice issues. I mean, just as why are we studying humanities in general? To be active members of society. That's why the whole discipline exists. To understand the issues that are at stake in society, and to be able to act on them constructively. So we can start off by sort of thinking about a few basic questions about culture. I mean, how do we understand culture? Let's define our terms. How might our culture, or the way we see and understand the world, affect the relationships we have with families, colleagues, and community? How might our culture advantage some while disadvantaging others in terms of injustice, racism, exclusion, and inequality? I mean, we're not, we will get onto, sort of the ways and means of understanding other cultures. But if we need to understand culture, I mean, we need to start with our own. We need to understand how, because we are sort of looking at the world from a subjective point of view, from a subjectivity, we need to understand how culture is influencing our own frame of reference, and our the modes that we adopt when attempting to relate to and communicate with others. So how do we understand culture? We need to this unit proposes that we start by understanding ourselves. And by getting a better understanding of ourselves, especially as speakers of the lingua franca, and especially as members of the richer countries in the world, that are maintained that way through have been maintained that way through global inequality and injustice, with consequential unequal power relations. That we need to understand, how we benefit from those, and how they jaundice our ability to communicate and understand with people from other backgrounds. To that extent, I'm going to introduce something a bit of theory, a bit heavier, in terms of looking at the history of colonialism, and how that kind of baggage influences our frame of reference as Westerners. Moore's culture versus nature binary is a great place to begin, I think. Moore is a political ecologist working in the US, written some great books, including Capitalism and the Web of Life, which is referenced down the bottom. I seriously suggest you go and check that one out. Moore talks about, in terms of the culture versus nature binary, attitude accompanying colonialism that sought to conceive of society and culture as external to nature, and as something to, as nature as like a state of chaos. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of the chaotic state of nature. The point of civilization was to tame nature and to bring it, into semblance of order. So there was a fundamental society or culture versus nature dichotomy used as a way to sort of justify and explain colonialism, which has, of course, birthed the world that we know and love today, with all its marked injustices and inequalities, and if nothing else, the divide between the first and third worlds, the global north and south, and with all the cultural baggage that that entails, a lot of it not very conscious. So Moore writes, in the centuries after 1450, the entanglements of capital, science, and empire enacted a series of socio-ecological and symbolic revolutions aimed at the creation of an external nature as a source of cheap inputs. So this is a bit wordy, but what he's saying, there's what he means in terms of socio-ecological and symbolic revolutions, revolutions and changes in meaning, the way we conceive of ourselves culturally, in order to justify colonial expansion and all that involved in terms of extracting resources from countries which today are at the bottom of the remain at the bottom of the economic pile, so that we can remain wealthy in the West. But conceiving of culture as money versus power versus nature, their objects, as things to be subordinated. As a related concept, we find in Savage Anxieties, The Invention of Western Civilization by Williams in 2012, saying the idea of the savage as embodied in medieval Christianity's biblical wild man was central to significant developments that helped to shape the history of the Western world and its relationship with non-Westernized peoples. A great example from one of the early lectures was the idea of the white man's burden, having to go tame the barbarians, tame the brutes, bring civilization to the heathen hordes, all this kind of stuff that they carried on with. So the savage is probably what Jung would call an archetype of this idea of wild nature, the chaos of nature that needs to be tamed by society in this very binary, Moorian binary between society and culture, and the savage nature. This brings us to key concepts for this first lecture. As we look at some of the history of colonialism, Orientalism, the concept that coined by Edward Said to talk about some of the narratives accompanying colonialism, ethnocentrism, and othering. So let's get into it. What is colonialism? Colonialism is defined as control by one power over a dependent area or people. In practice, colonialism is when one country violently invades or takes control of another country, claims the land as its own, and sends people, settlers in inverted marks, to live on that land. Down the bottom there's a link to an article in Teen Vogue, if you believe that. They're doing some interesting journalism there, which looked to me like a great article. So go and download the slides and check that one out. So it's after 1450, it was European powers going out and sailing to South America, the Dutch East Indies, all those kinds of places, and Africa, of course, and inserting themselves there in order to take resources and oftentimes slaves. Here we find a picture of Cecil Rhodes, famous 19th century colonialist, or infamous. This is a satirical picture from Punch magazine in the UK from 1892. The Rhodes Colossus. You've got Cecil Rhodes standing from one end of Africa to the other. Larger than life. It's dominating the scene. And this This is it was a that I think the idea here was for Punch to take the Mickey out of his grandiosity, but the grandiosity was sort of driven by a purpose to to exploit and extract, and that's in large part what they did, with the consequence demonstrated quite quite succinctly here. We got Africa dug out, and the earth piled on Europe and America, and that's what colonialism did. Someone pointed out in the lecture that they could have done the same to South America, and that's absolutely true. A lot of the gold in particular from South America went to Spain, which in this image isn't covered by very much dirt, but the same principle applies. Gold diggers, and that's colonialism. And how did they justify that to themselves? Well, in no small part by the idea of the savage other. On the left-hand side, you have two Native Americans, I think, in South America, attacking these butchers, these barbarians, attacking the hapless white lady who appears to be moments away from a brutal death. And this is, that's the savage nature, the wild, chaotic nature that needs to be tamed by Christian civilization. Same down the bottom with the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey, with a tribe of genuine Ibanji savages, with mouths and lips as large as those of full-grown crocodiles, from Africa's darkest depths, new to civilization. Non-westernized peoples being paraded around like circus freaks. I mean, that kind of says it all, really. From the darkest depths of the chaotic state of nature in Africa. Circus freaks. So that's the savage other. Which leads us on to Orientalism, which is a system of representations framed by political forces that brought the Orient into Western learning, Western consciousness, and Western empire. These are perfect examples of Orientalist representations. The figures in these cartoons speaking for themselves? No, not one bit. They're being spoken for with highly subjective representations, which have very particular political purposes and historical purposes as well. Down the bottom here, a couple of in this slide as well, are a couple of references for you to look at. Franz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, and Edward Said, Orientalism, both great reads, highly recommended. So the system of representations, I think, is the main point to remember. In the system of representations, the Orient exists for the West and is constructed by and in relation to the West. It doesn't exist on its own account. It only exists in relation to the West, and that's why we refer to what used to be called originally Mesopotamia as the Middle East. I mean, the Middle East isn't the area around Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Jordan. And that never used to be referred to as the Middle East. It's not Middle East in relation to itself. It's where is it Middle East in relation to? It's Middle East in relation to Western Europe and the UK in particular. Same with the Dutch Far East, the Far East Indies. I mean, the Far East Indies aren't Far East in relation to themselves. That's Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia is right where Indonesia is. It's only Far East in relation to Western Europe and the UK in particular. So that's areas being structured in relation to something else, and it's a hangover today. I mean, we don't talk about the East Indies so much today, but we do talk about the Middle East, and that's a classic example of Orientalism. The Orient is a mirror image of what is seen as inferior and alien to the West. So the West is superior and the known. The Orient is inferior and alien. To that being the case, Orientalism is a manner of regularized or orientalized writing vision and study dominated by imperatives perspectives and ideological biases ostensibly suited to the Orient. It is the image of the Orient expressed as an entire thought on scholarship. Because this needs to be explained. I mean, and the legacy of this continues. So how do we account for it? We account for it by maintaining the justifying narratives, even though they're getting very old. Overshot the mark a little bit. Within Orientalism, the Oriental is the person represented by such thinking. The man is depicted as feminine, weak, yet strangely dangerous because he poses a threat to white Western women. The woman is both eager to be dominated and strikingly exotic. Oriental is a single image, a sweeping generalization, a stereotype that crosses countless cultural and national boundaries. I think one of the great examples of that was Fu Manchu, the feminine, weak, and yet strangely dangerous. These foreigners are coming to steal our women and take our jobs. Edward Said, one of the quotes down the bottom, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So it's a system of representations with a clear political purpose for dominating, restructuring, and asserting authority. Here's a representation of the Orient, a pictorial representation of the Orient. This is the area today, which is known as the Middle East. Again, not Middle East in relation to itself, Middle East in relation to Western Europe. Just to drive the point home a bit, here's the Orient Express. Starts off in London, a few surprises there. Moves through Western Europe from Paris to Germany, through Munich to Austria, through Vienna to Hungary, through Budapest, Bucharest, and down through Belgrade and like the former Yugoslavia. Having passed through northern Italy, so yeah, stops. The blue one stops down near Athens. So the far reaches, the borderlands of the Orient, and it stops in Istanbul in Turkey. So yeah, train to the other side. Here's a global map. Broad representation. Obviously the areas in the Orient are non-westernized. They haven't even included Russia. Down the bottom is the Occident. Got North America, US and Canada, Argentina down the bottom, and Chile, I think, is it? I've included Saudi Arabia in this one, probably because just wealth alone. Western Europe is, of course, Japan and Australia and New Zealand. Is it a coincidence that we're looking at the poor and rich parts of the world? It's debatable, I think. Which brings us to ethnocentrism, a particular characteristic of Orientalism and also in turn of colonialism. Ethnocentrism is the view that one particular ethnic group is somehow superior to all others. The word ethnocentrism derives from the Greek word ethnos, meaning nation or people, and the English word center. In this context, ethnocentrism is the belief that a particular ethnic group's system of beliefs and values is morally superior to all others, which is implied by the word. So, one of the great things about using, descriptive rather than, technological terms, it's fairly straightforward. You can kind of, it's implied by the structure of the word itself. There's the Wikipedia link down the bottom if you want to check that out. Ethnocentrism, the technical name for the view of things in which one's own group is the center of everything and all others are scaled and rated with reference to it, from William Sumner. So yeah. Another definition. Here's a great cartoon describing practical ethnocentrism in practice. The world according to Americans. America, we're number one. Here's some more America out in the sea. Some down below is they do our laundry and lawns. Coffee comes from here, I think. Over in Europe are pussies. evildoers somewhere down around the, again, the Middle East, a place that only exists in relation to something else. Yeah, very simplified view of the world. Coal down the bottom, Santa up the top, communists over the far side, and the people who make our stuff beneath them. So yeah, and with a land of kangaroos. So yeah, very simple, and just plainly ignorant. And it's not far enough away from the truth for comfort, really, is it? Is a bit of political ethnocentrism. Being white is important to many of Trump's supporters. Sherry say their race is very or extremely important to their identities amongst those who support Trump at 47% versus other Republicans. Well, you don't need to have policies when you've got people who place that much value on things they had no say in, do you? But this is, says something about the value he's able to get out of that, doesn't it? But again, it's still ethnocentrism. And because we've got ethnocentrism, we have othering, which is defined as the creation, maintenance of imaginary representations, knowledge of the other in service to geopolitical power and domination. And a few links down the bottom. Do feel free to check those out. The Guardian piece is quite good. So here again, we've got the, if we define, go back a little bit, define Orientalism as a system of representations, then now, when we look at othering, we're talking about the creation and maintenance of imaginary representations, knowledge of the other in service to geopolitical power and domination. So if othering is knowledge of the other, and Orientalism is a system of representations, then it would seem to suggest that othering is a central facet of Orientalism and a critical part of it, and that and furthermore that the entire thing is imaginary, because it's not about understanding; it's about exercising power. Othering not only encompasses the many expressions of prejudice on the basis of group identities, but provides a clarifying frame that reveals a common set of common processes and conditions that propagate group-based inequality and marginality. A lot of stuff that a lot of time we'll just say that's just normal. That's just normal, and if you don't fit, you're some kind of terrorist. That's the way the logic works, and there's in that the kind of logic there's ethnocentrism, there's Orientalism. You're not even interested in sort of understanding people from others' perspectives, and there's the baggage of colonialism, because you immediately sort of putting someone into a box because you don't like them, and because they because it helps to propagate the things as they are, the status quo. So here's some examples of the other. The infamous, now infamous logo of the Washington Redskins up in the top left, next to the Washington Redskin. Got Stalin tentacle spreading his tentacles over the world. How communism works. Portraying a person as an octopus is, it's a nightmarish image, but also quite, it's designed to scare. Next to the Stalinist octopus, you've got the Jewish, another, horror figure, cracking the whip with a very big Star of David on his chest from the Nazi era, of course. Next to the horrible evil Jew is, another nightmarish image of the jazz, the saxophonist, with a very, grotesque stereotype of black people, and the Star of David on his lapel, just to play off the power that's already been generated over Jews. Just connect the Jews and the jazz singers, and it's all these threats coming to destroy our way of life. This other who's a threat to very very rigid views of normality. Down the bottom, we've got the evil scheming terrorist Osama bin Laden figure. Next to him is Apu from The Simpsons, who I'm sure you recognise. If you remember that one, there's a bit of a, people were complaining about Apu because apparently the joke was that he was Indian. He didn't do anything funny. It's just that he was from a different background. Thank you, come again. So people were sort of upset about that, and they ended up removing him from the show. Yeah, I mean it's sort of interesting to think about. Next to Apu, we've got Pat Buchanan. Feminism encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. Say that like it's a bad thing, Pat. It's yeah, it's not hard to see where the European witch hunts came from with that kind of hysteria. And they say that women get too emotional. It seems pretty hysterical, if you ask me. Next to Happy Pat, we've got some World War One propaganda. This is from the American side. Destroy this mad brute. Enlist. The Germans portrayed as a sort of semi-King Kong figure. If you actually read the sixth chapter of Hitler's Mein Kampf, he talks about the developing propaganda. He says he actually took most of his. He cites the American propaganda during the First World War as his main inspiration because they did such a great idea of demonizing the enemy. When the Americans went to war, they expected the Germans to be brutal, and when war is brutal, and when the Germans were as brutal as anyone is during war, it appeared, Hitler was saying it appeared to justify their propaganda, and he appeared to have learned his lesson by the time the next one rolled around, didn't he? So these are all representations of the other. Well, let's bring this back to the local context a bit. We're talking about the savage other, like taming the chaotic state of nature. How did this manifest in this country? Well, we found it with terra nullius, empty land, the British legal fiction used to justify British colonisation of Australia following the loss of the North American territories in the US War of Independence. It was, of course, eventually overturned by the Australian High Court in 1992 with the historic Mabo decision, but they still haven't acted on it in terms of treaties or suitable compensation for Indigenous people. Indigenous people are still suffering from like massive gaps in life expectancy. They have parts of the outback, with sharing third world conditions. This horrific intervention land grab based on sensationalizing sexual abuse in Indigenous communities. Like it, I mean, it's kind of interesting in the years since the intervention. I mean, we've had the Pell and the whole thing with the Catholic Church. I mean, now the number 3 in the Vatican from Ballarat is in jail, but we've still got this intervention business going on. We don't have any interventions in Ballarat, do we? But in the broader scheme of things, sort of, but all coming back to this. I mean, how are white people here anyway? Because this doctrine that the land was empty. They didn't even count Indigenous people as fully human in law until 1967. Before that, they were classed as part of the flora and fauna, 3/5 human being. This is within living memory. And there are some links down the bottom if you want to check those out a bit more. So this begs the question inevitably: where do we see colonialism, Orientalism, ethnocentrism, and othering in the terra nullius doctrine? And how do the associated set of cultural assumptions impact on how we interact with non-whites in Australia? These are broad questions that we need to think about during the semester. I mean, this is the kind of talk about the subjectivity and the blindness of sort of taking what we take for granted ideas of what normality. I mean, there's so much baggage attached to that. And, this might seem sort of quite heady and political, but really it's just history. And, maybe it says something about how much we sort of take for granted that, we never even have to, a lot of the time don't even have to think about this, where if you're an indigenous person, if you're not from like a Anglo background or a wealthy background, you probably think about it all the time, every day. And here are some more reasons why this might be the case. Let's take a quick review of some of the various features of intercultural relations in Australia. We saw the image of the Stalinist octopus earlier. Well, here's a local incarnation on that. This is the Mongolian octopus, which is published in a magazine in the 1890s here in Australia. There's one of our very welcoming and well-adjusted expressions of welcoming other cultures who coming into the country as if we'd been here for anywhere near as long as the indigenous people, and having people who aren't white in Australia was somehow bizarre and alien. So we got the Mongolian octopus, this really kind of horrific, nightmarish image of Chinese people, who, given the geographical proximity to Australia, are probably closer to indigenous than Europeans are. You had to cross the half the world to get here. So that's the Mongolian octopus. We got the classic singlet. This is Australia. We eat beer, we eat meat, we drink beer, and we speak fucking English. Well, we only had for about 200 years. I mean, before that, we spoke quite a number of indigenous dialects before we started shooting them all. Down the bottom, we've got John Howard, who was quite well known for staying in power by stealing the thunder of Pauline Hanson and shifting markedly to the right when she arose in order to maintain his grip on power, which he did successfully for quite some time, with the results we see in the middle panel down the bottom from the Cronulla riots. And of course, we know it in more recent times that, in addition to that unprecedented ugliness, we've had the new unprecedented ugliness in Christchurch. And this is where this hateful and toxic, othering and, ethnocentrism and Orientalism arguably leads. Expressed in, great images like the one in the window, F off, we're full, and of course, the entire, the baggage of the White Australia policy, which embraced by much of the Labor movement and the Labor Party to their eternal infamy. So these are the readings for the first week. If you're looking at this later in the semester, you may not have time to look at these, but do check out Globalization and Linguistic Imperialism of the English Language. The other two articles are quite useful too, which you will be able to use in your responses to Assessment Task 4. So do check these out. These are quite foundational readings for the semester, and think about how the key themes appear in the issues raised in these texts. The key themes we've talked about in this lecture today appear in these texts, and what the broader implications for intercultural competence and communication might be. So if you made it this far, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the revamped take on the first lecture. The rest of the lectures should be up online, so feel free to go and check those out, and the PowerPoint slides will be up as well.